Just curious. What device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
I never imagined that the unraveling of my marriage to Mark would leave me quite so utterly exposed and adrift in the relentless sprawl of Manhattan, where after the divorce proceedings that stripped away our suburban Chicago home, the joint savings account down to pennies, and even the faint remnants of my self-respect through his calculated lies and courtroom theatrics, I found myself wandering the rain-slicked sidewalks one particularly unforgiving afternoon, my stomach twisting with a sharp pangs of genuine hunger as I clutched a discarded newspaper for shelter, feeling more like a ghost haunting the edges of the bustling city than a 45-year-old woman who had once managed marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies with confidence and poise. The downpour had soaked through my thin jacket, turning the world into a blurry haze of neon signs and hurried pedestrians who averted their eyes from someone who looked as broken as I felt, and in that moment of profound invisibility, when even the street vendors seemed to ignore my tentative glances toward their steaming carts, a sleek black car emerged from the traffic like a shadow detaching from the storm, its tinted windows reflecting the chaos around me as it pulled to a smooth halt right at the curb where I stood frozen, the driver's door opening to reveal a woman in an impeccably tailored wool coat that spoke of boardrooms and quiet authority, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and her expression one of professional detachment mixed with a hint of something almost like pity as she stepped forward through the puddles and addressed me directly with a voice that carried clearly over the patter of rain. "Are you Sophia Hartley?" she asked, her gaze steady and appraising as if she had been searching for me amid the throng of umbrellas and anonymity, and I nodded slowly, wiping a strand of wet hair from my face while my mind raced through possibilities ranging from debt collectors dispatched by Mark's vindictive allies to some cruel prank orchestrated by old acquaintances who had watched my fall from grace with detached amusement, but she extended a business card embossed with the name of a prestigious law firm on Fifth Avenue, introducing herself as Victoria Lang and explaining in measured tones that she needed a few moments of my time regarding a matter of urgent inheritance from a great-uncle I had long considered a distant myth from family lore, Elias Hartley, the enigmatic figure who had disappeared into New York's high-stakes real estate world decades earlier, leaving behind only vague stories of fortunes made and enemies cultivated in the shadows of skyscrapers. We slid into the car's warm leather interior, the heater blasting away the chill as the vehicle navigated the congested streets toward her office in a gleaming tower that overlooked the park, and once settled in a conference room adorned with polished mahogany and shelves of leather-bound volumes that exuded an aura of unassailable wealth, Victoria laid out the astonishing details with the precision of someone who had delivered such bombshells before, informing me that Elias had passed away the previous week at the age of 92 in the solitude of his opulent penthouse, having amassed a fortune through shrewd investments and unyielding negotiations. And in a decision that bypassed the rest of our fractured family, he had bequeathed everything to me as his sole surviving relative, unmarred by the betrayals that had plagued his later years, encompassing a sprawling Manhattan estate perched above Central Park with views that could steal your breath, a meticulously maintained cherry-red Ferrari from the 1970s that he had treated like a cherished companion, and a staggering $53 million in diversified assets that would secure financial independence for generations if handled wisely. My hands trembled as I accepted the will from her, the document bearing Elias's looping signature and my name highlighted in bold, and Victoria elaborated that he had monitored my life from afar through discreet channels, aware of the divorce's brutal toll because Mark's infidelity had briefly surfaced in a local society column that circulated among old family connections, positioning me as the ideal heir who understood the sting of disloyalty without having succumbed to it herself, yet as her explanation flowed into the practicalities of probate and tax implications, a subtle shift in her demeanor signaled the complication she had hinted at earlier, leaning forward with a confidential air to disclose that Elias had imposed one very specific condition on the inheritance, a stipulation woven into the legal fabric of the bequest that demanded my active participation in fulfilling his final directive. something intrinsically linked to the skeletons buried within the Hartley lineage that could either elevate me to unforeseen power or drag me into conflicts I had never anticipated. The drive to the estate afterward blurred into a surreal procession of landmarks I had only glimpsed from tourist buses, the car depositing us at a private entrance where a doorman in crisp livery nodded deferentially, ushering us into an elevator that ascended silently to the top floors, and upon crossing the threshold into the penthouse, I was enveloped by a space that redefined luxury with its vast marble expanses, custom millwork housing rare first editions, and expansive windows framing the twinkling expanse of the city below like a kingdom laid at my feet, each room revealing layers of Elias's eccentric tastes, from abstract paintings that hinted at modernist influences to a fully equipped wine cellar stocked with vintages dating back to the post-war era. Exploring the garage later that evening, I encountered the Ferrari for the first time, its aerodynamic lines and restored interior evoking a sense of untamed freedom that contrasted sharply with the chains of my recent hardships. And as night fell, and I claimed the master suite with its king-sized bed draped in Egyptian cotton, the weight of the day's revelations settled over me like a tentative dream, prompting me to reflect on the small revenges I could already envision exacting upon Mark, whose smug assurance during our separation had left scars deeper than any financial loss. By the next morning, fueled by a breakfast of fresh croissants and strong coffee prepared by the estate's discreet staff, I accessed the secure email system Victoria had set up and composed an anonymous message to Mark's superior at the advertising firm where he still toiled, detailing with calculated vagueness the discrepancies in his expense reports tied to the affair that had unraveled our marriage, information gleaned from shared financial statements I had retained despite the settlement. Ensuring the tip would trigger an internal audit without implicating me directly, and thus delivering a satisfying jolt of retribution that arrived via a follow-up call from a sympathetic ex-colleague who described Mark's panicked scrambling in vivid detail. This initial act of clever payback infused me with a spark of empowerment, yet as Victoria returned with armfuls of paperwork outlining the estate's maintenance and the conditions' broader implications, her warnings about the family's opportunistic undercurrents grew more insistent, alluding to hidden compartments within the penthouse that held documents elucidating Elias's rationale for selecting me amid the vultures who had circled him in life. And in the midst of my eager search through an ornate desk in the study, where my fingers uncovered a small silver locket inscribed with cryptic initials that evoked a flicker of unease, the insistent chime of the front doorbell reverberated through the halls, heralding an intrusion that promised to shatter the fragile peace I had only just begun to embrace. Adjusting to the rhythms of the penthouse unfolded over those initial days, like slipping into a bespoke suit tailored from the fabric of forgotten dreams, where each morning brought the subtle luxury of sunlight filtering through automated blinds to illuminate a breakfast nook overlooking the park's verdant canopy. And I found myself lingering over plates of artisanal cheeses and ripe fruits delivered by a service that anticipated needs before they fully formed, all while the undercurrent of Victoria's lingering presence provided a tentative anchor amid the disorientation of sudden opulence that clashed so starkly with the raw survival instincts honed during my weeks of street-level desperation following the divorce's final gavel. She remained on site through the first full rotation of the sun, her organizational prowess transforming the chaos of unpacked legal files into a structured blueprint for my new reality, guiding me through the estate's hidden functionalities from the voice-activated climate controls that maintained a perfect 72 degrees to the biometric safe concealed behind a Rothko reproduction in the library, where she revealed the ignition fob for the Ferrari and preliminary access to the financial portfolios that promised to buffer any fiscal shocks with layers of diversified holdings in blue-chip stocks and prime real estate syndicates. Our tentative bond deepened during an impromptu dawn excursion in the car, as she suggested a low-key drive through the pre-rush hour avenues of the Upper East Side, the Ferrari's V8 engine awakening with a throaty rumble that vibrated through the chassis and into my bones, propelling us along deserted stretches where the city's awakening pulse felt intimate and alive, and in that cocoon of speed and leather-scented air, Victoria shared fragments of Elias's guarded history, recounting how he had risen from Ellis Island arrivals in the early 20th century to command a real estate empire through a blend of ruthless acquisitions and intuitive market foresight, only to suffer erosions from relatives who manipulated trusts and diverted rental incomes into their own pockets. A betrayal narrative that resonated uncomfortably with my own experiences of Mark's systematic erosion of our shared assets under the guise of marital equity. She even touched on a poignant anecdote from Elias's later years, describing an instance where he had anonymously funneled funds to support my undergraduate studies during a family financial crunch that my parents had downplayed to avoid burdening kin. A revelation that painted him not as the aloof specter of holiday tales, but as a silent guardian whose choices now encircled me with protective intent, though she deflected deeper inquiries into his motives with a lawyer's practiced evasion. Steering the conversation back to the practicalities of the conditions residency mandate that required my physical presence in the estate for at least 365 consecutive days barring brief excursions, a clause designed ostensibly to immerse me in the legacy's essence while subtly restricting mobility in ways that hinted at underlying safeguards against external threats. The intrusion shattered this budding equilibrium midway through the second afternoon, when the intercom buzzed with an unscheduled visitor announcement, and moments later, Cousin Lydia materialized in the foyer like a character stepping from a soap opera subplot, her bleach blonde waves and power suit evoking the archetype of a Long Island social climber who had parlayed family connections into a middling brokerage career, clutching a foil-wrapped bottle of discount bubbly that she thrust forward with theatrical warmth, while her eyes darted appraisingly over the crystal decanters and Persian rugs as if mentally cataloging assets for resale. She launched into effusive greetings laced with backhanded compliments about my fortunate timing in Elias's passing, insisting on a guided tour that allowed her to probe subtly about the will's allocations and my plans for the property, her questions veering from innocuous queries on maintenance costs to pointed suggestions that we collaborate on streamlining the inheritance to benefit the broader Hartley clan, a euphemism for her evident desire to carve out a personal windfall from the 53 million pie, and as she lingered in the study feigning interest in a collection of vintage maps, her facade cracked when she cornered me against the desk and proposed we jointly petition the courts to redistribute portions of the estate on grounds of Elias's purported mental decline in his final months, her voice adopting that syrupy persuasion often deployed by those who mistake condescension for charm in negotiations over shared bloodlines. Rather than erupt in confrontation that might escalate into legal fodder for her ambitions, I maintained a composed demeanor throughout her visit, escorting her to the elevator with promises of future discussions while inwardly seething at the audacity of kin who viewed tragedy as an opportunity for enrichment, and once the doors had sealed her departure, I retreated to the office nook equipped with high-speed connections and initiated a discreet digital reconnaissance using resources Victoria had outlined, uncovering a trove of archived communications from industry forums where Lydia had disparaged Elias as a relic hoarding outdated holdings in attempts to solicit clients away from his portfolio, material that I repurposed into an anonymous thread on a prominent real estate discussion board frequented by her professional circle, weaving in verifiable details of her questionable property flips involving inflated appraisals and undisclosed liens that prompted immediate scrutiny from peers without directly implicating my involvement. A maneuver that yielded rapid results as notifications pinged later that evening showing her profile besieged by skeptical inquiries and potential leads evaporating like morning mist. This act of understated retribution brought a wry amusement to my solitude over a solitary dinner of seared salmon and asparagus spears. The satisfaction of witnessing her overreach rebound upon her reinforcing a sense of reclaimed agency that tempered the isolation of my elevated perch, yet the evening's tranquility fractured when Victoria, having returned from a brief errand, presented me with a sealed envelope extracted from a locked drawer in Elias's private quarters, its contents a Handwritten missive dated mere weeks before his death, in which he alluded explicitly to the contours of my marital dissolution, as gleaned from public records and private surveillance, affirming his selection of me as heir precisely because the betrayal I had endured mirrored the familial deceptions that had embittered his existence, and he implored me to unearth the corroborating evidence concealed within the residence to comprehend the conditions imperative, a directive that stirred a cocktail of gratitude and apprehension, as the document's closing admonition to beware the fox in counsel's clothing lingered in my mind like an unsolved riddle. Just as I absorbed the letter's implications, folding it carefully into my pocket while pondering the depths of Elias's prescience, my cell phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unrecognized number bearing a Chicago area code, and upon answering, the familiar timbre of Mark's voice slithered through the receiver, laced with feigned casualness as he referenced the inheritance rumor mill and proposed an urgent rendezvous to discuss how we might realign our futures in light of my windfall. Mark's voice on the phone carried that same disarming charm he had wielded like a weapon during our early courtship days in Chicago, now repurposed with an undercurrent of calculated opportunism as he wove tales of remorse over the divorce's hasty finality and hinted at intelligence gleaned from overlapping social networks about my abrupt descent into Elias's realm, suggesting we meet face-to-face to explore avenues where his business acumen could safeguard the inheritance from predatory elements that inevitably shadowed such windfalls, but I cut the conversation short with a curt dismissal that masked the surge of adrenaline-fueled wariness coursing through me, disconnecting the call while my pulse thrummed against the quiet opulence of the penthouse's evening hush, knowing full well that his reemergence signaled not reconciliation, but a predatory bid to reclaim a portion of the $53 million through whatever manipulative leverage he could muster from our shared history. The encounter propelled me deeper into the labyrinth of Elias's archived life the following week, transforming the library into a makeshift command center where I methodically unpacked crates of yellowed ledgers, correspondence bundles tied with faded ribbons, and photograph albums that chronicled his trajectory from a sharp-eyed immigrant navigating the post-war housing boom to a formidable developer whose signature adorned landmark deals across the boroughs, each page revealing the incremental sabotage inflicted by siblings and extended kin who had forged addendums to leases and diverted escrow funds into offshore accounts disguised as charitable trusts, their actions culminating in a cascade of IRS audits that isolated Elias further and fueled his reclusive final decades. A pattern of familial avarice that echoed the incremental dismantling Mark had orchestrated in our marriage through selective disclosures to attorneys and inflated claims of emotional distress that swayed the judge toward an inequitable split. Victoria assisted sporadically during these sessions, her insights into legal precedents illuminating the nuances of Elias's countermeasures, like the irrevocable trusts he had established to shield core assets from such encroachments. Yet, as we pored over a particularly damning dossier on a 1980s partnership gone awry, I began to scrutinize her role with growing skepticism, noting how she deflected questions about her long tenure with Elias by pivoting to administrative minutiae and how her access to the firm's digital vaults seemed to grant her an almost proprietary familiarity with the documents that bordered on possessive, prompting me to wonder if the fox in counsel's clothing from Elias's letter alluded to an insider whose loyalties might fracture under the weight of competing interests. The ethical quandary crystallized when Cousin Theo, Lydia's brother and a partner in a midtown law practice known for aggressive estate litigation, arrived unannounced one crisp autumn morning with an air of contrived collegiality, his tailored pinstripes and gold cufflinks projecting the veneer of a family elder seeking harmony as he presented a leather-bound proposal outlining a voluntary reallocation of the estate's liquid assets, framing it as a $2 million inducement to preempt costly probate battles and preserve Hartley unity, his pitch laced with veiled threats about the mounting expenses of defending against challenges from multiple aggrieved relatives who viewed my claim as an affront to their presumed entitlements. In that suspended moment amid the study's oak-paneled confines, where sunlight slanted across the proposal's fine print detailing escape clauses that would leave me exposed to further demands. A pragmatic voice whispered temptations of swift resolution and the freedom to jettison the conditions' entanglements without delving into the family's festering underbelly, a path that might have appealed to the survivalist pragmatism forged in my post-divorce wanderings, yet yielding to it would have mirrored the very capitulations Mark had exploited. So instead, I orchestrated a subtle counterstroke by agreeing to a public luncheon at a bustling midtown bistro favored by the legal crowd, where over plates of seared foie gras and crisp salads, I steered the conversation toward reminiscences of Elias's philanthropy while casually referencing a recent article on ethical lapses in estate planning, planting seeds of doubt that prompted Theo to overcompensate with boasts about his firm's unblemished record, only for me to innocently share a fabricated anecdote from a mutual acquaintance about a similar case involving questionable notary practices, a ploy that circulated through the dining room's networked patrons and snowballed into anonymous tips to the state bar by evening, effectively tarnishing his professional sheen with whispers of impropriety that forced him into damage control, and handed me a gratifying layer of deterrence without descending into outright confrontation. Observers might deem my refusal of the bribe and subsequent evasion of direct authority involvement as short-sighted recklessness, particularly given the mounting pressures from Mark's orbit and the cousin's maneuvers. Since alerting regulators to the unearthed forgeries could have neutralized threats swiftly and insulated the inheritance from contestation, but withholding the evidence felt like a strategic deferral, preserving leverage for the conditions' unfolding requirements while honoring Elias's implicit directive to handle the revelations on my terms, though this choice amplified the internal friction as I confided fragments of my discoveries to Victoria over a late afternoon espresso in the solarium, where the glass walls framed the park's fiery foliage like a living tableau. Her responses grew evasive under the scrutiny, culminating in a confession prompted by my pointed reference to the letter's warning as she outlined the conditions' deeper mandate beyond mere residency, requiring me to consummate a singular, final transaction in Elias's stead with a consortium of erstwhile associates linked to the historical frauds documented in the files, a role that positioned me as a nominal proxy in negotiations over a dormant property holding that could either vindicate his legacy or ensnare me in complicit shadows if the dealings veered into illegality, and just as the implications settled like lead in my veins, evoking a dilemma between dutiful inheritance and personal peril, the elevator's arrival chime echoed from the foyer below, accompanied by the unmistakable cadence of footsteps that belonged to Mark, who had evidently bypassed security protocols through sheer audacity or insider facilitation, his presence materializing in the doorway with an entourage that included a burly figure clutching a briefcase of what he claimed were irrefutable proofs, challenging the will's validity. Mark's arrival in the penthouse foyer unfolded with the dramatic flair of a poorly scripted reunion scene from one of those cable dramas that prey on viewers' appetites for domestic upheaval. His tailored blazer slightly rumpled from the journey as he positioned himself strategically between the elevator doors and the main hallway, flanked by a private investigator whose bulldog build and clipboard suggested a career built on digging up dirt for divorce attorneys, and the man wasted no time in launching into a monologue that blended faux paternal concern with thinly veiled accusations, claiming he had flown in from Chicago upon learning of the inheritance through a tip from a shared acquaintance in the legal community, insisting that we revisit the divorce settlement in light of this unexpected boon that could fund a more equitable division of assets he had supposedly undervalued during the proceedings, his words dripping with the implication that my windfall rightfully included reparations for his fabricated narrative of emotional abandonment painted in court documents. Victoria materialized from the adjacent office with her tablet in hand, her expression a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed the flicker of calculation in her eyes as she interjected with reminders of the will's ironclad provisions and the futility of revisiting a finalized decree, But Mark pressed on undeterred, directing the investigator to unfurl a series of printed exhibits, including grainy surveillance stills from my street-dwelling days that he argued demonstrated a pattern of instability unfit for managing an estate of such magnitude. Positioning himself as the stabilizing force ready to assume fiduciary oversight through a proposed conservatorship that would grant him veto power over disbursements from the 53 million pool. The tension escalated into a standoff that stretched across the afternoon, with arguments volleying through the living room's vaulted spaces where sunlight glinted off the grand piano Elias had favored for solitary nocturnes, and as the investigator droned on about forensic accounting reviews that could tie up the inheritance in litigation for years, I felt the old patterns of Mark's gaslighting resurface, his assurances of mutual benefit masking the predatory intent to siphon funds through fabricated consulting fees or joint ventures that would entangle me anew in his web of dependencies. The true confrontation ignited later that week when Lydia and Theo descended upon the estate in tandem with a battery of their own attorneys, transforming the formal dining area into an impromptu deposition chamber where they unveiled petitions to probate court contesting the bequest on multiple fronts, alleging undue influence from Victoria's firm and Elias's documented eccentricities in his declining health, complete with affidavits from supposed witnesses who claimed he had expressed second thoughts about naming an estranged niece over blood relatives who had maintained sporadic contact, a narrative bolstered by a dubious audio clip purportedly capturing Elias muttering reservations in a hospital corridor that Theo waved like a smoking gun. This assault crystallized the moral crossroads I faced, as defending the will demanded my testimony in an upcoming hearing where I would need to affirm Elias's lucidity and intent based on the personal letters and surveillance notes that painted an intimate portrait of his choices. Yet doing so required embellishing the timeline of my relationship with him to portray a closeness that existed more in his distant observations than in lived interactions, a fabrication that carried the risk of perjury charges if exposed and potentially unraveled the entire inheritance while subjecting me to cross-examinations that dredged up the vulnerabilities of my divorce and homelessness in lurid detail for public consumption. Those around me, perhaps even the imagined audience peering into this saga, might view my hesitation to seek immediate judicial intervention or to disclose the full cache of incriminating family documents to neutral arbitrators as a self-defeating gamble, one that prolonged exposure to the cousin's harassment and Mark's encroachments when transparency could have fortified my position with unassailable evidence, but navigating the conditions' veiled directives compelled a more circuitous path, preserving the leverage of Elias's secrets until the final transaction could neutralize the threats from within. Seizing an opportunity for reprisal amid the mounting pressures, I leveraged the invitation to a high-profile charity gala at the Plaza Hotel that the family circle had long used as a networking arena. Donning a sleek emerald gown from Elias's archived collection that accentuated the poise I had reclaimed through these trials and circulating among the glittering assembly of philanthropists and power brokers with a demeanor that blended graciousness with subtle reconnaissance. Spotting Lydia holding court near the auction podium, her laughter ringing hollow as she bid on a gaudy diamond necklace to bolster her social facade, I approached with a flute of champagne in hand and engaged her in light banter about shared family lore, only to pivot seamlessly into a whispered confidence about an upcoming feature in a society newsletter detailing her entanglement with a prominent developer's spouse, particulars I had extracted from cross-referenced emails in the estates, digital archives, and corroborated through discreet inquiries to mutual contacts. The revelation timed to coincide with the arrival of the gentleman's wife who had been primed by an anonymous heads-up, resulting in a scene where Lydia's composure shattered amid the crystal clinks and murmured speculations, her hasty retreat to the powder room leaving her isolated and the evening's buzz centered on her unraveling rather than the estate's disputes, a deft maneuver that not only diminished her influence in the clan's maneuvers, but also sowed discord among allies who now questioned her discretion. The triumph soured upon returning to the penthouse under the cover of night, where Victoria awaited in the dimly lit library with a dossier outlining the impending transaction's mechanics. requiring me to pose as Elias's long-standing confidant in a closed-door meeting with investors harboring stakes in the fraudulent property syndicate. A deception that demanded forged endorsements and verbal assurances under oath-like conditions that blurred the lines between inheritance duty and criminal exposure, her assurances of minimal risk clashing with the ethical revulsion that knotted my stomach at the prospect of perpetuating the very deceptions Elias had railed against. The pivotal twist emerged during a solitary midnight perusal of her unattended briefcase, where nestled among routine filings I discovered a micro-recorder containing snippets of conversations that relayed estate valuations and my personal schedules to an external party, the timestamps aligning suspiciously with the cousin's escalations, and the voice on the playback bearing a cadence too akin to Theo's for coincidence, igniting suspicions that Victoria's allegiance might extend beyond fiduciary obligations to a self-serving arrangement that positioned her as the conduit for the opposition's intelligence. Confronting her in the shadowed alcove as dawn crept over the skyline, I demanded elucidation on the locket's inscription that matched her estranged lineage and the discrepancies in her firm's billing logs that suggested unreported diversions, her denials fracturing under the weight of evidence until she admitted partial complicity in monitoring me at Elias's behest, but deflected on the recorder's origins, leaving the air thick with unresolved deceit just as my phone illuminated with a text from an unknown sender detailing Mark's formal pact with Lydia and Theo, complete with scanned agreements that pledged his testimony against the will in exchange for a percentage of any recovered assets, the message concluding with a threat to release the street photos to media outlets unless I capitulated by week's end. The threatening text from the unknown sender lingered on my phone screen like a venomous afterthought in the midst of the penthouse's pre-dawn stillness, its stark details outlining Mark's alliance with Lydia and Theo through a scanned memorandum that allocated him 15% of any contested winnings in exchange for his damaging depositions and the release of those humiliating street photos to tabloid editors hungry for tales of rags-to-riches opportunism, a ploy that aimed to portray me as a fabricated beneficiary undeserving of Elias's largesse and capable of swaying public opinion against the will before the probate hearing could convene, forcing me into a corner where capitulation might preserve my dignity at the cost of half the $53 million or resistance could amplify the scandals into a media frenzy that eroded the inheritance's foundations. This escalation ignited a resolve tempered by the accumulated betrayals of recent weeks, prompting me to barricade myself in the estate's lower-level study until the first light pierced the reinforced windows, where I accessed the basement vault that Victoria had reluctantly disclosed under escalating pressure from my interrogations, its reinforced door yielding to a combination etched faintly on the locket's interior that now felt like a mocking key to the family's Pandora's box, revealing shelves lined with meticulously organized files that chronicled the full scope of the Hartley fraud syndicate from its inception. In the late 1970s, through a web of shell corporations and laundered transactions disguised as legitimate urban renewals, documents that implicated not only the cousins' forebears, but also Elias himself in the initial structuring of offshore entities that funneled profits away from taxable oversight before his eventual disillusionment led to this posthumous reckoning. The journal at the vault's core, bound in weathered leather and filled with Elias's increasingly erratic script, unveiled the condition's ultimate architecture as a multifaceted trap designed to compel the enemy to orchestrate the syndicate's dismantlement by anonymously disseminating the evidence to federal investigators upon completion of the residency term, a process intertwined with the final transaction that served as bait to lure lingering participants into self-incriminating positions, yet the entry's closing passages sowed seeds of ambiguity regarding his own role, confessing to a youthful complicity born of survival instincts in a cutthroat industry that blurred moral lines and questioning whether his bequest represented genuine atonement or a vengeful perpetuation of the cycle by ensnaring an innocent in the same ethical quagmire that had defined his existence. Armed with this arsenal, I emerged from the vault with a plan coalescing around the themes of exposure and retribution, first addressing Victoria's duplicity by summoning her to the library at midday under pretense of Reconciliation, where I presented the recorder's transcripts alongside discrepancies in the firm's ledgers that traced kickbacks to Theo's practice. Her protests dissolving into admissions of coerced involvement in Elias's surveillance protocols that had extended to monitoring my post-divorce movements as a litmus test for resilience. A revelation that confirmed her as the letter's eluded fox and prompted my immediate termination via a severance wired from the estate's accounts coupled with instructions to vacate the premises within hours, a decisive severance that isolated me further but liberated the narrative from her manipulations. Even if outsiders might decry it as an overreaction born of paranoia that severed a potentially valuable ally when collaborative testimony could have bolstered my defense against the mounting legal assaults. The climax materialized through a meticulously staged invitation extended to Mark, Lydia, and Theo for a purported settlement conference in the Penthouse's grand salon that evening, baited with promises of concessions on the transaction's proceeds to draw them into the lion's den, where they arrived in a convoy of chauffeured sedans radiating premature triumph. Mark leading the charge with a briefcase of forged affidavits, while the cousins flanked him like courtiers anticipating coronation. Their collective pitch revolving around a revised proposal that demanded 40% of the liquid assets in exchange for withdrawing the contest. And suppressing the photos, a greedy overreach that I met with feigned consideration as I guided them toward the garage under the guise of reviewing the Ferrari as a neutral asset in the negotiations. Once ensconced amid the vehicle's gleaming ranks, with the overhead lights casting dramatic shadows that amplified the tension, I activated a concealed projection system linked to the vault's digitized archives, flooding the space with holographic displays of the incriminating ledgers, wire transfers, and witness statements that mapped their familial culpability in excruciating detail. The visuals synchronized to audio clips of Elias's dictated accusations that echoed through the speakers like a spectral indictment, prompting a cacophony of denials and accusations that fractured their united front as Lydia accused Theo of withholding key documents and Mark scrambled to distance himself from the Hartley taint. In the ensuing pandemonium, I initiated the final sting by transmitting encrypted packets of the core evidence to the District Attorney's Cybercrimes Unit and the Securities Exchange Commission via pre-programmed servers. The uploads irrecoverable and timestamped to coincide with their on-site admissions captured by hidden microphones, while simultaneously dispatching tailored dossiers to Mark's corporate overseers detailing his embezzlement ties to the scheme and alerting Lydia's brokerage regulators to her complicit flips, a multifaceted assault that unraveled their schemes in real time as notifications buzzed on their devices heralding audits, subpoenas, and client defections. To cap the chaos with symbolic flair, I slid into the Ferrari's driver's seat as they lunged toward the exit in disarray, revving the engine to a thunderous crescendo that pinned them momentarily in the glare of its headlights before accelerating in a controlled pursuit through the building's subterranean passages. The chase evoking a cinematic purge where the car's vintage power outmaneuvered their frantic dashes to the elevators, leaving them breathless and cornered until security, summoned discreetly, escorted them out amid wailing sirens approaching from the streets above, a witty denouement that transformed Elias's prized possession into an instrument of poetic justice without crossing into illegality. In the quiet aftermath, as the estate's systems locked down and the first waves of official inquiries filtered through Victoria's former channels now redirected to my oversight, I ascended to the balcony where the city's nocturnal symphony unfolded below like an indifferent witness, clutching the locket whose initials now evoked Elias's labyrinthine psyche and pondering the bequest's lingering enigmas. Had his condition engineered true restitution for the fraud's victims, including the displaced tenants chronicled in the files, or merely shifted the burdens onto me as a proxy for his unresolved guilt, forcing choices that tainted the fortune's purity with the residue of complicity? The $53 million remained intact pending clearances, yet as I weighed the option of liquidating portions to fund independent audits or walking away from the tainted legacy to rebuild on unencumbered terms, the ambiguity persisted like the fog rolling in from the harbor, leaving me suspended between secured isolation and the perilous allure of unchecked reinvention, wondering if any heir could truly escape the shadows woven into the very threads of such an inheritance, or if the cycle of betrayal and revenge was destined to echo indefinitely in the lives it touched.